Hello and welcome. This is Professor Jessie Daniels, and today I'm going to be talking with you about the trouble with white women and the challenge of calling in as a guest lecture. So I'm happy to be here with you. I hope you're all well and safe and um, indoors. Okay. So this is what I'm going to talk about today. I'm going to cover these 7 topics. You can pause the lecture at any time, rewind it, come back to things that you don't understand. But I also encourage you to save questions for our Q&A session, which I'll be calling into your class for on someday soon. Okay, so I'm going to talk about how I got interested in the subject, why it's personal for me, a brief and very impartial history of white women in the U.S., this inflection point of the 2016 election. And then I'm going to talk about some research I've done that I think you read for the class, first about popular culture and then about the wellness industry. And then I'm going to close by talking about the challenge of calling in and why that's so hard. Okay, so I'm going to start out telling you how I got interested in this. So I've lived in New York City now for almost 30 years, but I grew up in Texas, and that's where I went to graduate school at UT Austin. And when I was in graduate school, this is the late 80s, early 90s, it was the very beginning of people talking about something that we all now refer to as intersectionality, but it was kind of a new topic back then, and I was fascinated by it. And one of the reasons I was fascinated by it is because it was so interesting theoretically, but I was also interested in a lot of the research that was going on at the time, like this one by Dr. Hazel Carby, who was writing about violence and empire and sexuality from a black feminist theoretical perspective that incorporated intersectionality. And I was just really struck by that example and wanted to know more. So I started doing some historical research, and I learned about Ida B. Wells Barnett. And Ida B. Wells Barnett wrote this now quite famous publication called A Red Record that was published in consecutive years starting in about 1892 and went through 1895. And in it, Wells Barnett, who was a journalist and a sociologist, she documented, reported, analyzed lynchings as they were happening. And she was one of the first people to point out in print that the practice of lynching really rested on 2 myths, 2 lies really, that were at the center of this practice. One was that black men were inherently sexually violent, that is, that black men were inherently rapists. And 2, that white women were especially susceptible to such attacks, and that white women were ontologically innocent. That is, in their very being, they were inherently innocent. And so what was lynching? It was, a lot of times people have a misunderstanding of what it was. It's any kind of extra legal murder, that is, murder that happens outside of the legal system. It's part of a campaign of terror. When we talk about lynching in the United States, we're talking about a period of time roughly between 1877 and 1950. It's a very rough date estimate, and the numbers are not really super clear. Historians think it was around 4,000 lynchings. It was probably a lot more than that because many of them weren't recorded. Those that were recorded, the way that they were recorded wasn't that the government or any government body was keeping track of them. They were often published in the paper. So there are newspaper accounts of them. And that's also part of what Wells Barnett was doing, is she was keeping a record, and it's part of why her publication was called The Red Record. So it's a record of these lynchings because they weren't being officially counted. So part of what drew me to this period of American history and this fact of racial terrorism in the United States was that white women were active participants, in addition to being sort of the centerpiece in terms of victims of these alleged rapists. They were also active participants in lynching and in the construction of white supremacy. And I was fascinated by that, both because I had a sort of burgeoning feminist consciousness, and this was not talked about. So I couldn't quite figure out how to put these things together. So not only were white women, I learned in doing this research, active participants in lynching and white supremacy, there was a tiny, tiny, small percentage of white women who fought against lynching, including one organization called the Association of Southern Women for the Prevention of Lynching. And I can say more about that in the Q&A if you have questions about it. This is the woman that founded it. Okay, so that research and that set of questions about sort of intersectionality and racist violence led me to finish a dissertation on white supremacist literature that became my first book, White Lies, and then I followed that up by looking at those same groups as they moved on to the internet. And that was my second book called Cyber Racism that came out in 2009. So I have these two books, these two pieces of research that look at white supremacy on either side of the internet, really, of the rise of the popular internet. And so I'm happy to talk with you about what difference the internet made and what changes I saw between those two times. So now I want to shift gears and talk a little bit about why this is personal for me. So I told you I was intellectually curious about all this, and I certainly was, but I want to situate myself a little bit more, and this is not really about self-aggrandizing or putting myself in the middle of this, but it's really about a kind of accountability that Black feminist scholars talk about, and they talk about the epistemology of lived experience. In other words, what we know, epistemology is just how we know what we say we know, the epistemology of lived experience. So Black feminist scholars have talked about it's very important to situate ourselves in relation to research, and so that's what I'm doing here, in addition to telling you a little bit about myself. So I mentioned that I was having this burgeoning feminist consciousness, and when I was in graduate school, and that's absolutely true. I sort of begun to think about feminism when I was an undergraduate, but really I think became a feminist when I was in graduate school, and this just in the last few years. In 2013, we saw the 50th anniversary of the feminine mystique, and there were a lot of articles like this one which were just asking, are you better off than your grandmother? And I have to say that I certainly was. This is actually a family photo. I'm the baby in this photo. It's taken in 1962. And that's 4 generations on my mother's side of the family. So my mother's the one in the very fashionable polka dots there and the sunglasses. That's her mother standing next to her. And then it's my great-grandmother who's holding me. So 4 generations. And none of these women ever graduated high school, including my mother. My grandmother, my great-grandmother, who I knew as Big Granny and Little Granny, because Big Granny was taller than Little Granny, they didn't finish elementary school, right? So my ability to get a PhD and have a really different life than the women in my family had was really because of feminism. There's really no other explanation about that. But it also raised questions for me about, this question about white women and where we fit in sort of the landscape of American culture. So this is the first book I read as an undergraduate that started me thinking about feminism, and it really changed my life in lots of different ways. And then I want to talk a little bit about my dad's side of the family. So I grew up in Corpus Christi, Texas, which is on the Gulf Coast. This is my dad and me about 69, 70. I think I'm getting ready to go to a piano recital is what explains the occasion of this photo. And then this is that same driveway a couple of years later. I think this is 71 or 72. My father again, and then his father on the other side of him. And part of the mythology that I grew up with as a kid was that we were Native American, that we were Cherokee, and And really the only evidence, well, not the only evidence, but the predominant evidence was my father would point to his dark hair and his high cheekbones and see, I must be Cherokee. I was in the middle of doing that dissertation on white supremacist research when I learned that my grandfather, this person in this photo, was had been a member of the Klan in the 1920s. And I was really shaken by that revelation. I probably shouldn't have been, but because there were 4 million people in the Klan in the 1920s, and it made perfect sense from a sociological perspective that he would have been in the Klan. But it really shook my world, and I have been trying to make sense of that ever since. So it's also part of why the questions that I had about white womanhood really became personal for me, because then I saw myself as written into this history and wondered where I fit and how I could disrupt this legacy of white women mostly supporting white supremacy, and how I could fit into the tiny strand of white women who were fighting against it. And then this is my mother's side of the family. This is my grandparents are on the right-hand side of this photo, and I'm always struck by this photo because it's taken in 1930, and they don't look that different to me than the people in the crowd of a lynching. And so when I look back through American history, I see my family as part of the lynch mob, and I'm troubled by that, and I want to understand how to change that going forward. So a little bit about when I was in graduate school. This is the professor that I worked for and with, Joe Fagan. And while I was in graduate school, I had this experience of working on this book that he did with another professor there named Melvin Sykes, who has since passed away. And Melvin Sykes was remarkable. He was a member of the Tuskegee Airmen. Living with Racism was a qualitative study of middle-class Black Americans and their experiences of racism. It's a longer story that I can tell you more about in Q&A, but basically my job as a research assistant was to transcribe these interviews, and I sat down at that at that tape recorder, at that headset, when I was transcribing these, as I think sort of a standard white liberal. I had moved from the racism of my parents, but I hadn't moved that far, and I was probably one of those people who was saying, well, if people are say they're experiencing discrimination, they're probably just oversensitive, they complain too much. Anyway, after I did about 300 of these interviews, and I was in listen-only mode. I could only listen to these accounts of racism and type them out. I was a completely different person. It radicalized me, really, because I learned that people weren't making things up. They weren't being too sensitive. If anything, they were trying to make excuses for the people who were discriminating against them, people who probably looked like people in my family. So I was really radicalized by that experience, and that was in the early 90s. Okay, so so then I finished this book, and I can talk more about what happened after I wrote this preface. I don't want to get into that right now. We can talk about it in the Q&A. Okay, so let me go on to this brief impartial history of white women and this is in the U.S. We could move the lens out and look more globally and talk about white women in colonial history, and I have some suggestions for reading if you want to do that, but I'm going to just talk about white women in U.S. history, and this is going to be quick through U.S. history, so my apologies to any of you who are students of history or history majors who want more of the details, but I have lots of reading I can send you if you want that. Okay, so let's talk about the 17th to 19th century. That means the 1600s to the 1800s here in the U.S., and how have white women and white feminists been connected to racism historically? I mean, with this conversation in the United States, we really have to begin with slavery and how white women were not just witnesses to slavery, but active participants. White women were co-owners of enslaved people along with white men. And this went on for hundreds of years in the United States. And a lot of this, if you read this history, is interwoven with familial relationships, right? So white women um, used enslaved women to breastfeed their own children. They used enslaved children to take care of, um, what we would call care work. So there, there are ways in which slavery was both this brutal and violent institution, and it was this um, brutal and violent institution in these very intimate, familial ways that we tend to think of now in these kind of glossy terms of, uh, women's inherent instincts or something about motherhood. So um, slavery and racism is interwoven with how white women were wives and mothers during this period of American history. Were active participants and beneficiaries of slavery. And this is just a clip from 12 Years a Slave. If you haven't seen that, I highly recommend it. It does a nice turn in some ways with the brutality of slavery and white women's participation in it. If you can stand it, I recommend is probably too strong a word for that film. And that legacy of slavery does not end in 1865 when slavery ends. There are places today in the United States, like this place, that host weddings and receptions and party events for predominantly white guests at former plantations. It is unfathomable in a way that this practice goes on. If you think, for example, in a different context in Germany, if people were hosting wedding receptions at Auschwitz, these were forced labor camps. They were not places to celebrate or have wedding receptions. A tiny handful of white women resisted that institution and advocated for social justice, like the Grimke sisters. You may have read about them. But for the most part, white women were active participants in the system. There were some who were abolitionists and pre-feminists, like Sojourner Truth, Frederick Douglass, the Grimke sisters. But the early suffragists, who you may have heard about, Susan B. Anthony, others have really split from the abolitionists. They parted company from them specifically around race. Susan B. Anthony has this famous quote where she says, "I'd cut off my right arm before I would ever work or demand the ballot for the Negro," language of the time, and not the woman. So there was this way in which black men, here again, were pitted against white women, and it was the suffrage, the white suffragists, who were doing this. Lots has been written about this around the recent anniversary around suffrage for white women. And another white suffragist at the time, "You have but the ballot in your hands. You have put the ballot in the hands of your black men, thus making them political superiors of white women." This is very common at the time. And we're talking now in the late 1800s, early 1900s, that this is going on. There were black women suffrage, like Ida B. Wells Burnett, who tried to join with the white suffragists, but they were excluded. There's a famous story of Susan B. Anthony sort of making Ida B. Wells go to the back of a parade that they were having. So real intense support for whiteness and white women's votes over black men or black women getting the vote. And you see this reproduced in popular culture, and this is, I'm going to talk more about popular culture in a second, but when you see the film Suffragette, which was made in 2015, it really reproduces this history and sanitizes it in a way. It's all white women. We don't hear any of the stories of women of color who were advocating for the vote, and we get a really sanitized version of the white women's racism at this time. It's all just a noble struggle, and we're invited to ignore race. Okay, I told you I'm moving through a lot of history very quickly. On to the 20th century. So now we're talking about the 1900s and white women in feminism. So what happened after suffrage? We have this moment in the 1920s where we have this this move, really, a lot of people talk about into the modern era. We have the rise of flapper girls. So dress and fashion changes a lot for women. You start seeing bobbed hairdos. That was very radical at the time. You get these shorter dresses, more skin is revealed. And you have the rise of the automobile, which really changed dating and social relationships. And you have the first sort of moment of consumerism as feminism. So there's a way in which becoming a flapper, bobbing your hair, dressing a certain way, was seen as the cool way to be a feminist. And these women who were sort of the daughters of the suffragists saw the suffragists as sort of old and tired, and they didn't want to be like them. Okay. At the same time, in the 1920s, when we have the flapper girls happening and sort of consumerism as feminism, and we're moving past suffrage, we have white women who are doing this kind of organizing in the Klan. And this is marching down Pennsylvania Avenue in the nation's capital. And this is about 1924. And there are millions of white women in the Klan. There's a tiny handful that resist, like actively resist the Klan. But the majority of white women are doing this either in the Klan or supporting the Klan at the time. So we have also, in the 20th century, we have the Great Migration of African Americans. And you may have heard this. There's a wonderful book by Isabel Wilkerson called The Warmth of Other Suns. Highly recommend that if you haven't read it. The Great Migration really spans most of the 20th century from 1915 to 1970. And this is what it looks like. You can see most African Americans at the time in 1950 are living in the Deep South, and then they begin to flee. The original way this story was told is that African Americans were seeking economic opportunity in the North. While that's certainly true, you also have to read this history in the context of lynching and really see it as people fleeing the racial terrorism of lynching. And that's part of what's happening here. So they're both factors. In sociology, we talk about push factors and pull factors. Racial terrorism is pushing people out of the South, and economic opportunity is drawing them to the North, to the upper Midwest, and to the far West, California, the Pacific Northwest. We have an economic depression in this country, until now, the worst economic depression we've seen from basically 1930 to 1945. And during that time, this is especially hard on African Americans. They're hit even harder by the economic depression than white Americans are. And yet, the popular culture of the 1930s is one that reifies this kind of angelic, innocent fantasy of white women and white girls. And no two examples of this are more emblematic than Snow White, which was first created in the 1930s, and Shirley Temple, who is this character that you see on the right. And just another personal note, my mother, who was born in 1934, was named Shirley, and she was named Shirley for Shirley Temple. So there's a way in which white people were buying into this kind of fantasy of what it meant to be white and female, right? Both of those things are gendered femme. Both of those things are being co-created in the popular culture of the 1930s. At the same time that we have this economic depression, and even more, we have racial terrorism happening, African Americans being plunged into poverty. And yet this is the story that we're telling ourselves about who we are in the United States. Okay, going on to World War II. You've often heard about Rosie the Riveter. You don't often hear about the black women that worked in the munitions factories. These were often segregated jobs. So there were jobs that were designated specifically for black women and for white women. So those jobs, even though they opened up more opportunity, often carried with them this legacy of segregation. Right. Again, moving quickly through history onto post-World War II. This is the period from 45 to 65, roughly. We have the rise of suburbs. And this really changed the way that Americans lived. It also came with racial deed restrictions. So most of the suburbs that were built after World War II were built with the idea of providing housing for GIs who were coming back from World War II, but only for some GIs. So these houses, this is a picture of Levittown out on Long Island. These houses it was only possible for white GIs to buy these houses. African Americans were not able to buy these houses. This is a sign from Detroit in the 1940s, sort of making this explicit. Oftentimes it wasn't as explicit as signs like this. It was written in the deeds and who you could sell the house to. It was actually in the contract. The rise of the suburbs also gave rise to this other moment in popular culture around white womanhood, and it gave rise to this notion of the housewife. And that had these unintended consequences later. But there was this idea that after working in factories during World War II, that white women especially would go back into the household and be housewives full-time, and they would serve their families. And there's some really great research about this time period in American history where one of the things that happened was that recipes and cookbooks got much more complicated now, because it was sort of like trying to find a way to give women something to do who are not working outside the home, but were trying to fill the time of working inside the home. But this kind of story about who was leaving munitions factories was one that was just told about white women. There weren't advertisements about black women as housewives, or that they needed to fill their time, because what was happening for black women at this time is that they were going into usually domestic work, so they were working for these white women, or they were going into a very limited set of clerical jobs. Okay, so moving on, we have the civil rights movement from about 55 to 69. And although there's a lot of talk about the civil rights movement as a very nonviolent movement, and certainly those were some of the principles of it, it was also an incredibly violent movement, and violent on the part of the state, violent on the part of white people who were resisting integration and resisting the goals of the civil rights movement. This is an image from Bloody Sunday, 1965. That's John Lewis there, who's being beaten by the police. This is in Selma, Alabama. And when you look at this history, I mean, we hear one version of civil rights history, but we don't often hear what white women were doing, which is millions of white women were organizing against integration and for segregation. This is what white women, probably the white women in my family, if they had been political at all, would have been doing. White women supported segregation throughout the civil rights movement. There were a tiny handful that resisted. I don't know if you've ever heard of Viola Liuzzo. She was a Italian-American woman, white woman who came from Chicago to the South to drive workers who were registering voters, and she was shot and killed by the Klan in 1965. But it's hard to find a long list, certainly not even hundreds or thousands of white women who were doing this kind of work, and certainly none that were risking their lives, as were African Americans at this time. So it's important to see the big picture here, right? Millions of white women who were supporting segregation, and a tiny handful who were resisting, like Viola Liuzzo. Okay, moving on to the 70s, we have the second wave of feminism. And this book by Betty Friedan called The Feminine Mystique. I don't know if any of you are watching the series on Hulu right now called Mrs. America, but it sort of deals with this history, and there's a great turn by Tracy Ullman, the comic actress playing Betty Friedan. That's quite good. But this book really had a huge impact because, in a way, when she is writing about in this book, The Problem with No Name, what she's talking about is all those women like her who were well educated but were being told that they needed to be housewives. So they go on to become housewives, and they're very unhappy, as Friedan talks about, because there's just not a lot to do being a housewife. So she talks about the dissatisfaction of the housewife, and that's the problem with No Name. And she calls for a movement, really, for women to rise up and basically reject the role of housewife. And this is a quote from Friedan saying that today the problem that has no name is how to juggle work, love, home, and children. She's saying that it's not enough just for women to stay home and raise children, that they have to have work in addition to these things. So we have Gloria Steinem and I believe it's Annie Potts, who are feminists. The second wave of feminism is more racially integrated than most people believe it to be in retrospect, but it still had its problems. One of the great things about the second wave feminist movement is there was a lot of attention to what today we would call care work, the idea of paying for domestic labor, for welfare rights organizations, seeing those as part of the feminist struggle. So it was a very different from what we often think about with the second wave feminist movement. At the same time, and this again is part of what this series on Hulu is dealing with, there were women who were organizing against feminism and against the policies that the feminist movement was advocating for. And one of the chief people that was doing this was Phyllis Schlafly, who's pictured here on the right. She had an organization called Stop ERA, and it was a predominantly white organization. I don't know that there were any black women in the Stop ERA organization. It was really centered around white women and on protecting the rights of those white women who wanted to be housewives and homemakers and have that status protected. It was really about status. Okay, I'm going to skip the 1980s through the early 2000s. I want you, just as a thought experiment, maybe if you have to write a paper, think about what was going on with white women in the 1980s, 90s, early 2000s. That's your time period to think about. And I'm sure you can extend what I've been doing here to those decades and think about some examples on your own. Okay, let's talk about 2014. This is going to get a little intense here, so I just want to give people a heads up about that. 2014 is when Michael Brown, who had just graduated from high school, was shot and killed by police in Ferguson, Missouri. His body was left on the hot sidewalk on an August afternoon for hours. And there's no indication that he was doing anything wrong. He certainly wasn't armed. And reports were that he put his hands up and said, "Don't shoot." And he was shot and killed anyway. That death and the injustice of his death led to the launching of Black Lives Matter. I'm sure you have heard about this, know about it. And it was really started by three black women who all identify as queer. And they talked about it as a movement, not a moment. And what was also interesting to me about this, and this is a famous photograph here of, I believe his name is Ed Crawford, who was one of the protesters in Ferguson, who has since been killed. And his circumstances of his death are a mystery, really. No one knows how he died or who killed him. But what I want us to pay attention to in the context of this discussion is really the absence of white women. And that, in some ways is maybe a good thing, like maybe white women didn't belong there, but it's not that white women were not aware of this and not commenting on it. And one of the people I just want to highlight that was aware of this and commenting on it is this woman, Catherine Nardi. She is the wife of the Ferguson police chief. And she got a lot of heat for posting something on Facebook about her views about blacks in her community, talking about their feral and animals, and they live their lives off the earned tax dollars of other Americans, and somehow they are the victims, right? So I just want to draw that contrast about what's happening in the street. People are hurt and enraged and mourning and angry over the death of Michael Brown, and we have this white woman who's really, on the side of the police and denigrating black people in her own community, right? Okay, I want to talk just briefly about the 2016 election. I'm not going to spend a lot of time here, but I want to just talk about it because it was an inflection point for a lot of people. A lot of people began to question their assumptions and their core values following this election. For many white feminists especially, they felt like it was a time to do something. So I want to talk just a little bit about this election. So what we know from this election is that white women voted, a majority of white women voted for the Republican candidate. Overwhelmingly, black women and Latina women voted for the Democratic candidate. And what a lot of people have argued is that this vote by white women made the difference for the Republican candidate, that that's what put him in office. And if they had voted more like black and Latina women, that we would have had a different outcome to this election. There's a lot of speculation about the election, but that's one of them. So the other thing that people have talked about is the kind of profile of who the Trump women voters are. And what a lot of people have argued is that these women are voting for the GOP, that is for the Republican Party, and against their own interests, right? Why are, and there were so many opinion pieces right after the election that said basically what this one from Vogue is saying is why are they doing it? It was like this mystery, right? And I want to argue that they're not. These women are not voting against their own interests. Whiteness is their interest, and that's what they're voting for. They're intentionally voting for whiteness, as I've just shown you happens throughout U.S. history. White women are standing up and representing for whiteness. Okay, I want to shift now and talk about some of the research that you read for this class about popular culture, and talk about why popular culture is important and how white women figure into this. And we're 2/3 of a way done, so I'll finish up here soon. Okay, so popular culture is important. I think it's important to study because it's the stories we tell ourselves. It's stories we tell ourselves about ourselves. It's like how we say, this is who we are the stories in popular culture. And since the beginning of film in the United States, white supremacy has been part of that story that we tell about ourselves. So the very first film that was ever created in the United States is called Birth of a Nation, and it's based on a book called The Klansman. P.S. By the way, this is how I found out that my grandfather had been in the Klan. I was at a relative's house. I pulled the book of The Klansman off the shelf, and I asked my aunt, why do you have this book? And she said, I don't know. It was your grandfather's. I opened it up, saw his name in it. She's like, why would he have this book? She said, oh, he was in that group, I think. And it was no big deal to my family, but it was a big deal to me. Anyway, popular culture. The Klan, white supremacy, has always been part of it. And white women have been part of that story as well. In Birth of a Nation, it's a white woman that the Klan is protecting, supposedly, from a black man who is actually a white man in blackface, but that's for another lecture. But white women, again, this is 1933. Remember what we were saying about the 1930s popular culture? This is a famous movie with famous movie stars at the time about a white woman who was in danger by these men in her life. Anyway, white women are central to American popular culture, especially in film, especially Hollywood. Fast forward to almost today. This is 2010. You know, Vanity Fair, the magazine, does a cover every year of who the sort of hottest stars are, the Oscar nominees for Hollywood films that year. And it really is just a study in whiteness and white women, because it's so often just a cover filled with all white women. So this was 2010's cover. In 2015, we have The Hollywood Reporter doing the same thing. Every actress in Hollywood, and the Hollywood Reporter roundtable cover is white. So this just is a feature, not a bug, of Hollywood popular culture. And it also translates to how we think about feminism, right? So there was this whole moment of white Hollywood actresses talking about themselves as feminists, and one of the really unfortunate memes that they tried to start was this one, "I'd rather be a rebel than a slave," which was in 2015. Really kind of tone-deaf moment in white feminism. Yeah, and then there are Hollywood stars that get pushed out as sort of representatives of white feminism. Here are a few recently. One of the points that I made in the cyber racism book is that without an explicit challenge to racism, white feminism gets easily grafted onto white supremacy, and it's useful then for making all sorts of other arguments. So I'll show you how this works in popular culture. So here's Taylor Swift, and this is an actual quote from her saying, "Pride in one's own race is a normal and healthy sentiment," and of course, this got her voted most popular among Nazis and the alt-right, who began to see in her a kind of icon. Whether she intended it or not, that is what happened. Okay, so moving on to these pieces that you read really quickly, I just want to give you a little context for them, and maybe they'll make a little more sense with this information. Okay, so popular culture is stories we tell about who we are, stories we tell about drugs, and justice is one slice of popular culture that I've been fascinated with in some of my work. So in 2008, you may have heard about Jennifer Schulte. She was on the internet, became known as Barbecue Becky because she called the police in Oakland because there was a black family setting up a barbecue pit in a public park, and she thought that was against the law and the police should come and arrest them. So how did that get to be a meme? What does that have to do? Why did that resonate in the popular culture in the way that it did? Well, I think to understand that, we have to really understand the way narratives about drug use are racialized and how that becomes part of our policing and part of the language that we use. So there's a long history of drugs and race being connected. So you can, lots of scholars have done this, but you can sort of chart each moment of immigration, each group of immigrants that come in, and there becomes a story about their drug use that gets woven into their experience as immigrants in this country. And so one of the famous ones is with Chinese immigration around 1890s to 1920, and the belief that they were bringing opium into the United States. And you see here the use of the word opium fiends, the story of San Francisco. That was sort of the idea that Chinese immigrants to San Francisco were bringing opium. And P.S. by the way, this was often seen as a way that they lured white women, was by giving them opium. So this is Harry Anslinger. He was the first basically head of drug enforcement in the U.S. government, and his tenure in the U.S. government spanned several presidents, so he's a very powerful figure. And this is a quote from him saying there are 100,000 total marijuana smokers in the U.S., and most are Negroes, Hispanics, Filipinos, and entertainers. Their satanic music, jazz, swing result from usage. This marijuana causes white women to seek sexual relations with Negroes, entertainers, and others. So here you have this kind of perfect storm of drug use, racism, and sort of concern for the protection of white women all rolled up into an ideology pushed by the head of drug enforcement for the U.S. So all of our drug policy is really rooted in these beliefs, because what he started back in the 1920s has carried through to today. So that's the story that we tell ourselves about drug use and what it does to people. And this continues to be part of how we look at drug use in the United States. So the way that race shapes these dialogues is when, just in general, when a white person, here celebrity culture, but when a white celebrity dies of a drug overdose, such as Corey Monteith in 2013, then it's tragic, right? All this potential lost. It's terrible what happened. He was such a good kid, right? He gets this whole backstory. And then when it's a black celebrity, for example, Whitney Houston, there's this kind of degradation in the coverage, right? Here's her drug den. Of course she was a drug addict, right? It's sort of like, well, what do we expect, right? So there's a kind of inevitability about it when it's a black celebrity versus it's the final tragic days of Corey Monteith. So how do narratives about white women play a role in narratives about drugs? Well, this has really been the focus of this research that I did with a couple of colleagues, and we looked at these two television shows, one Intervention and one Law and Order. Intervention is what we call a reality-based TV show. It's not really reality, but it's reality-based, and Law and Order is what we call a scripted television series. And you've maybe seen both of them. I'm assuming you've seen Law and Order, maybe not seen Intervention, so I'll give you a little more background on that. So Intervention is this reality-based series, and it follows this formula. There was this young girl, she was so perfect, she was a cheerleader, and now here she is on the crack pipe, right? So it's this kind of fall from grace of the people who are featured on the show. This is the money shot. If somebody's injecting or they're inhaling, as you saw in the last one, that's always a close-up of the drug use, is the money shot. That's featured in every episode. And then the kind of dramatic conclusion is this gift of intervention, right? So they bring the person who's using drugs into a room and they collect all their friends and family around, and basically they coerce them into going to rehab, and that's called an intervention. And this guy that's standing up is one of the interventionists, and he's extending his hand, and he always says, I'm offering you the gift of intervention. But basically what the people around are doing is they're exerting a lot of social and sometimes material pressure, like you will cut you off financially, you'll get thrown out of your home. So there's not a lot of actual choice. There's lots of coercion in this. So the show claims to have this really incredible success rate. Like they claim something like 85% of people have been are clean and sober from being on the show, but it's actually there's very little evidence for that. Most of the shows have this kind of an epilogue. Carissa completed 45 days of treatment, then left, and she relapsed and sometimes overdosed. So there are at least 4 or 5 people who've died after being on the show, and many of the people are using drugs again. However, the idea of intervention pervades a popular culture. So, again, oftentimes in celebrity culture, when people die of drug overdoses, people, in retrospect and telling about their deaths, will say, "Did you try an intervention?" Even though it doesn't actually have the success rate. It's what people refer to as something that could have saved their lives, right? We see 2 examples here from China, the World Wrestling Federation star, and Michael Jackson, who needs no introduction. what we found when we analyzed the show Intervention is that 87% of those who are featured are white. Now, why is that interesting? It's interesting because we have this culture and this history of telling stories about drug use where it's, as you saw in the Anslinger quote, it's people of color who are the users of drugs, not white people. So why do they do that? Why did they make that choice on Intervention to have 87% of those being featured who are white? Well, this is a quote from Dan Partland, who's a producer of Intervention. He says, we have a very long list of different elements we try to find a story. The most important one is, will the story in some way challenge the stereotype of what addiction is? So we have this interesting kind of moment of Through the Looking Glass, where we have the stereotype of addiction, which is that people of color use more drugs. Factually not true. And yet, to correct this stereotype, we use more white people in the telling of the story. And part of the way that they use them is to make white people sympathetic, right? She was a cheerleader, and now she's on the crack pipe. This is a way of giving the characters 3 dimensions and making them more sympathetic. Right? We see the same thing in Law and Order. So this is a scripted series. We looked at lots of years and lots of episodes and did a content analysis. Same thing we did with Intervention. It's the same years. And this is the original franchise. So these are the main players on the show. And what we looked at here is when there were storylines that were drug involved. So what we found was that when white women are rarely featured as drug involved, they're mostly not, what we find is that they're portrayed as sympathetic characters in need of repair with hope for redemption, right? Oh, again, the tragic fall from grace is what we see again and again. And in Law and Order, our analysis revealed that 68% of the drug-involved characters are white women. Again, a disproportionate number of people. Mostly, though, on Law and Order, what we see are white women as prosecutors. That's really where white women show up on this. And I know that one of these women is Latina, but she's very white passing. And that's really the place that white women appear in Law and Order as the prosecutors. And so there's a way in which that role, white women as prosecutors, becomes both a sort of emblem of feminism, right? Like, oh, look, they're doing the same job as a traditionally male job. And it also kind of softens what we think of as the carceral state, right? You know what I mean by carceral state? It's the machine that is the justice system that prosecutes people, locks them up, puts them in jail and prison. Right, so there's this kind of dual thing that these white women prosecutors are doing. They're both sort of being the symbol of feminism, in these very tailored suits that they're all in, and they're also kind of softening the edge of the carceral state. Right, it's a very deft kind of trick that they do. So what's going on in both these series, we argue in this article, is that there's a way in which white women get this particular kind of agency around drugs that is not afforded to other people, either men of color or women of color, any people of color at all. White women have agency, and in Intervention, they have agency around getting well, right? We're offering you the gift of intervention because we think your life is worth reclaiming. And then in Law and Order, they have this agency around, well, we're going to lock up people, including people who have used drugs. So it's 2 different kinds of agency. We call it, one is therapeutic agency and one is carceral agency, right? So 2 different ways of thinking about the kind of agentic, that's the adjective form of that verb, the kind of agency that white women get to have in popular culture. And that matters, right, in terms of what we think we can do in the world and who has power. Okay, I'm just going to say a little bit about the wellness industry and then move into the conclusion. So thanks for paying attention and for coming back if you have. So I want to talk a little bit about the wellness industry. The wellness industry is ripe for all kinds of critique, and and one of the easiest critiques to make, which doesn't necessarily have to do with whiteness, is that a lot of us fall for these sort of pseudo-scientific claims. And one of my favorite ones is about clean eating. There's no clean or dirty eating unless you're eating things off the street, right? Like, so there's a lot of pseudoscience in the wellness industry, but that's not really the critique that I want to talk about today. I want to really talk about whiteness, and there's really kind of no better symbol of whiteness in the wellness industry than Gwyneth Paltrow. Now it's kind of easy to harsh on Gwyneth Paltrow, but there's something about the way that she is marketing and quite successfully marketing wellness that really speaks to a particular kind of white woman identity. And part of what she's doing also is drawing on indigenous cultures. There's an interview that I talk about where she's on one of the late night shows, and she's talking about this practice of earthing, where you go out and you walk barefoot on the earth, and this is from indigenous culture. And she even says, I don't really know much about it, but I just think it's important that we pull from all sorts of alternative healing modalities to give that to our consumers, right? So she's really reproducing this kind of settler colonialism in her approach to health. And the other thing that I want to just say about Paltrow is, and her Goop Health, is that it reinforces a particular kind of white, cisgender, hetero lady identity that she then makes to seem natural and in need of care, right? And there's a way in which we're invited not to think about race when we're in the Goop universe or in her healing world, because those are unpleasant or uncomfortable or not in line with wellness, right? And the brands of wellness that Paltrow and lots of these other wellness gurus are selling ignore the things that people actually need to be well, like ending poverty or systemic racism or providing free access to care or universal basic income or any of those things, right? It's all very individualistic. It's ripping off other cultures, and it's probably not based in any kind of science. Okay, having just done this call out of Gwyneth Paltrow, let me talk to you about the challenge of calling in. So how do we do this? We live in what's been called a call-out culture, and a call-out culture is just basically where you slam someone, you critique them, and then you say that they're canceled, right? That's call-out culture. So the opposite of that is calling in, where you say, hey, I wonder if you've noticed that you're doing this. And could we have a conversation about it? So how do we do this calling in with white women who are participating in all kinds of harm in the culture? So the place that this came up, I mentioned it when we talked about the 2016 election. The place that this really, I saw this conversation percolating was around what some people began to call the 53% issue, right? The problem of white women who voted for Trump. And you saw this at the Women's March even. This is a sort of famous photo that got snapped. It's actually a bit of a stage photograph. This is the photographer. That's his wife holding the sign, don't forget white women voted for Trump. But it's also a bit of a call out, right? Because part of what they're doing in this photo is framing those three white women standing on that barrier with their pink pussy hats and holding up their phones, taking a selfie and checking their Instagram, whatever, right? It's really a critique of these three white women, right? It's a call out of them, and it's a valid call out, right? It's like, I mean, part of what's implicit in this is, where were you 2 or 3 years ago when Ferguson was happening, right? There weren't millions of white women marching, saying Black Lives Matter, right? They were at home watching Netflix or, going to Goop health summits, right? How do we reach those women? How do we get to those women and call them in on the harm that white womanhood is creating? Well, there are two sort of takes on this in the wake of the 2016 election. In one way, one person was saying, this is Katie Herzog, saying, you want to change the way white women vote, you have to move to a red state and join an evangelical church. Basically, it's just saying this is, you're not going to do it staying in your bubbles of Democratic voters. You're going to have to go and really change your life if you want to reach these women. And then there's Jessica Valenti writing about the same time, saying, don't even try. Just give up on these women who voted for the Republican in 2016. There's no use in trying to flip these. And in some ways, both of these writers are saying is we can't do it. We really can't reach out to these women. Can't call them in. And part of the explanation, I think, for this is white fragility. There's a book by Robin DiAngelo called White Fragility. It's basically what she's arguing is that white people have so much shame around racism and systematic racial inequality that if you try to talk to white people about this, that they just shut down. They either get really defensive and can't hear what you're saying, or they begin to cry, or talk about themselves. Like, there's just all sorts of ways in which basically shame keeps white people from being able to deal with the harm that they're causing. And I think this is especially true for white women. This is a hypothesis. I don't have evidence for this, but I think this is especially true for white women because we're so trained to be good and to be perfect. And a charge of racism is so loaded in our culture right now that it feels like a terrible accusation. So how do we do this? Well, I think that white women have got to learn how to be less fragile, how to shift focus. And I think part of this has to do with the way that we think about feminism. This is Sheryl Sandberg, who's second in at Facebook. She's the COO, Chief Operating Officer. So it means she's second just to Zuckerberg. And she's written a book called Lean In, right, where she's talking about how women can be more powerful in their jobs, right? And her argument is that women just need to lean into the boardroom or whatever conversations they're having at work so that they can be taken more seriously, right? And I think that this is the wrong way to shift focus. I think we've got to move away from this individualistic way of thinking about feminism, and we really have to change our ideas. This is again Sandberg. She says we hold ourselves back in ways both big and small by lacking self-confidence, by not raising our hands, by pulling back when we should be leaning in. This is really the inherent philosophy of her feminism. And I think for white women, that part of what we have to learn to do is to lean back. We have to lean back and let other women, let people of color take the lead in organizations where we might have been groomed to take the lead. I think that's really part of the key. And we have to shift our focus away from white families. A lot of the ways that white women have mobilized around supporting racism and white supremacy and racial segregation has been around protecting their white families, the white nuclear families. And I really believe that these are the engines of inequality, that we really have to shift our focus away from the nuclear family and have a wider angle of vision. We need to expand our vision of who we care about. We have to de-center whiteness. It's kind of an academic way of saying that, but what I mean is put less focus on what benefits white people and less focus on what we've been taught is valuable. We have to widen the circle of those we care about beyond the nuclear family, beyond white people. And we have to learn how to dismantle white supremacy. It's not going to be easy, but we built this so we can do this. And we have to learn to work for the collective good. I think if there's any silver lining in the coronavirus, it's that it may reset us. It may shift our focus to seeing that we're all connected and that we have to work for the collective good. All right, there's a bunch of reading that you can do if you want to learn more about this. I'll send this along to your professor so that you can look up this and read what you want. Okay, thanks so much. Find me on Twitter if you want to talk more about this.